Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty and today we are going to play with vellum. We're going to play with vellum and see how many ways we can use it for our paper crafting projects, and if you stick around to the end I have a couple of home decor ideas. Now if you don't know what vellum is, I have two previous videos on vellum. One explains how to pick the vellum that's right for your project, and the other one talks about how to attach vellums to projects. And that comes into play because vellum is a paper-like product that is translucent, and that translucent nature of vellum is what makes it unique, but it also makes it challenging to attach. I've linked you up to those videos for easy access to get you caught up. Now let's dive into this video, starting off with some easier ideas and working our way up to more complex ideas. As you saw with that previous clip, and again with this clip, vellum provides a softening effect, which I call dimming, and that is great to use on these bold patterns of paper, which you like the color and pattern to, but perhaps you need to soften them up just a bit so that your project can stand out. Keep in mind that different thicknesses of vellum as well as multiple layers of vellum will provide more or less dimming depending on what product you're using. And the contrast between your vellum and your background will also be a factor in how much dimming effect you get. Well, you can use whole sheets of vellum to create an entire overall softness on a project. More often than not, you're going to use bits and pieces of vellum. So one of the ways that I use it is by punching it or die cutting it. And here's a tip. If you have a punch that doesn't behave well with vellum, add a sheet of cardstock or paper behind the punch and the vellum, and that can get you a crisper result. Now remember, anything that you can do with paper, you can pretty much do with vellum. But here's one idea with punch shapes, and that is to create patterns. And you can do this with any punch shape you want. What I do most often with vellum is to use it as a layering behind other elements on a project. And so here I've got it used as a matte layer behind photos. If you have a die set that has multiple layers to it, you can always cut one of those layers in vellum. So here on the left, I've got a single layer of vellum behind my word, and on the right, I have 2 layers of vellum behind that word. I use them very often in layering behind embellishment clusters to help that cluster stand out just a little bit more. So like I said earlier, vellum acts a lot like paper, and what you can do with paper, you can also do with vellum, including stamping. Now there are just a couple of differences with vellum that we'll talk about. Now I have several varieties of ink here that I'm going to be stamping with. I do have a permanent stays-on ink that is like an alcohol-based ink. I have a pigment metallic ink. I have a distress oxide ink, which is kind of a mix between a dye ink and a pigment ink. And then down at the very bottom, I have the very typical dye-based ink. And as you'll see through this, they all work on vellum. The differences are that the dye-based ink, and especially the oxide inks, will take a little longer to dry on vellum than they do on paper. And you can see me, I'm kind of doing a smudge test as I go between the paper and the vellum. That slower drying quality on vellum will actually give us a benefit to another technique that we'll talk about next that you can't necessarily do with paper. But here's why I like to stamp on vellum. It can really help your images hold their own against busy pattern papers on projects. Now here's a tip. Vellum can be just slightly slick, and I've exaggerated that quality there by twisting my stamp. If that is your problem, be sure you stamp straight down, pull straight up, and if your paper sticks to your stamp, slowly peel it back away from your stamp, and that should give you good results. Very closely related to stamping, of course, is heat embossing. Now, some people worry that you can't heat emboss on vellum. They think it might burn or melt the vellum, but I assure you it works just fine. So first, here I'm going to stamp in a typical heat embossing way using a heat embossing ink, and here I've got Versamark, which is my favorite embossing ink. I'm going to pour my embossing powder on top of it, and then I'm going to go ahead and heat it up. So the trick to heating up vellum is to make sure your embossing gun is nice and hot before you even bring it to the paper. So I wait about 30 seconds before I heat my paper. I'll do a little heat on the front, a little heat on the back, and then voila, you can see the images starts melting right away and my embossing is done. No damage to my vellum whatsoever. But the best advantage I think vellum has over paper is this slower drying quality, and that's going to allow you to use basic dye-based inks as embossing inks. No need for any specialty ink products at all. So I'm going to stamp just in my regular dye-based ink. I'm going to make sure that I work a little quickly, but don't worry too much about it. And then I will sprinkle my embossing powder on that ink, and it is wet enough to stick. Now my embossing gun is already hot from previously, so you can see here I've got my embossing melted right away, and I get a pretty colored embossing, and I can get any color of embossing that I want with just one bottle of clear embossing powder. Now that we have some stamping and embossing done on our vellum, we can move on to this stained glass technique. So I have both an embossed and an image stamped in permanent ink. Now you can do this with water-based markers, and that's actually my preference, or you can use alcohol markers, but we'll talk about the pros and cons of each. First up is the alcohol markers, which will dissolve both embossing powders and permanent ink. So if you're going to use them, either work on the backside or use a dye-based ink. And that is why I prefer the water-based markers, just your typical marker, even kids' markers. And I do prefer to work on the backside just because that stamped image gives you some wiggle room, so you don't have to be so precise in your coloring. Now working on the backside does dull back the color, so you might want to add multiple layers of color. And that is actually easier to achieve with the regular markers than it is with alcohol markers. Now, alcohol markers on paper will give you better results with multiple layers, but on vellum, which is a much slicker surface, you'll get better results with a typical marker. And there you can see 2 layers on the right and a single layer on the left. And the translucent quality of this vellum gives you that stained glass effect. If you stick around to the end of the video, I do have a home decor project using this technique. Now, I like this technique best on solid color backgrounds, but you can do it on top of patterns as well. And depending on your methodology for this, you can get different looks to this technique. Backing Cutfiles is something you can do with vellum, which will give you a much softer and subtler look than using different patterns of paper. Plus, because you can see through the vellum, it is super easy to see exactly where you need to line up your paper in order to back your cut file. Now it's confession time. I actually hate backing cut files, and I'm actually pretty lazy because I don't like taking the time to get clean cuts. As you can see on that dark paper, my edges are definitely wonky, but when you put that same file on a busier pattern paper, those mistakes or laziness can blend into the background and disappear, so you don't have to be as detailed of a crafter when you're using vellum, which I appreciate. Next up is alcohol inks, which is a very hot trend in the crafting world. And if you don't have alcohol inks, don't skip this part because I will have you covered with another way to do this. Alcohol ink techniques usually require a specialty paper called UPO, which is actually not paper but a kind of plastic, and it can be expensive and hard to find. With vellum being in between a paper and a plastic at a much cheaper cost, we can use that instead of UPO. Now I do have blower devices here to spread my inks around. You could just use a straw if you don't have a blower device. And with all that being said, we can go ahead and start playing with this alcohol ink. After some experimentation, I did find it best to wet my vellum first with a bit of alcohol. So I put some alcohol in a dish and used an old paintbrush to rub alcohol into the zone where I'm going to be adding my color. Here I put it at the bottom, and then I can blow that color around with my blowing device. There's lots of ways to use alcohol inks, but this is one of my favorites. So you can see the pretty mixed media effects you can get with this vellum. Now, alcohol can dissolve adhesives, so you do want to use an old paintbrush and then just rinse it out with a little bit of water when you're done to protect those paintbrush bristles. Now, if you don't have alcohol inks, this is the part for you. This could also work with ink pad refill bottles if you do have stamping inks and their refills, or even a concentrated watercolor product could work. I do find that different ink manufacturers have different additives that they put in their ink to make them dry quicker or differently, and that can affect the viscosity of the ink as you're using this technique. So experiment with your inks first before you do this, and you can probably come up with a result that you like. As I was experimenting, I did add some water to my paper because these are water-based inks and not alcohol-based inks, and played with that a little bit. The water does warp the vellum, so that can be a drawback to this method. Now, the inks that I'm using here are from Concord and Ninth, and I know that they do have an additive in them that makes them particularly thick as this medium, but in a moment you'll see me using a different brand, and I will get a different result with those. Here I am using the Stampin' Up brand of reinkers, which don't have the same additives to them. And you can see that I'm getting much more flow to these ones. And in a moment, I'm going to actually add some water to the paper to see the difference between those two. And you'll see that I get even more flow to this and a softening effect to the colors. So that's a wide range of options that you can try if you don't have any alcohol ink. While you can do mixed media straight on your project, using this vellum has a few benefits. One is that it has a bit of a plasticky quality, and so you can get this technique to work on vellum where you can't get it to work on paper. Also, that vellum does mute the background a little bit, helping that mixed media stand out just a bit more. Plus, you get this try before you buy method where you can put that vellum onto your project and see if you like it before you attach it down. Another one of my most used vellum techniques is to do journaling on vellum, both handwritten and printed. I prefer doing printed journaling on vellum because it makes it so easy to line up. I pre-size and pre-print my journaling on a sheet of plain copy paper, and then I tack my vellum over that printed journaling with some temporary adhesive, and you can see exactly how to line it up because it is see-through. You run that same paper back through your printer, and then you can peel off your printed journaling, rub off the temporary adhesive, and add it to your project. I tend to do this on a thicker vellum, but if all you have is thinner vellum, you can add multiple layers until you get the translucency that you need. Adding a vellum pocket to your project is another fun technique, and I will just trim my vellum down to the size that I want my pocket to be and attach it to my project. Here I'm just using glue, and I will cover up that glue with pattern paper, but if you watch my how to attach vellum video, link up in the corner, then you could get lots of other ideas about how to attach this vellum to create a pocket. All you need to do is leave that top spot open so that you can slide stuff into it. Now, a pocket is nice because you can add extra photos, like a stack of extra photos, into a pocket that you wouldn't otherwise have room for. Here I am pretending like I have a lot of journaling, so I'm adding multiple pages of journaling just by layering them up and stapling them, and then I can slip that into pocket, still see my journaling, but yet get everything I need to say onto the page without taking up too much room. For card makers, a vellum pocket is a fantastic way to add a gift card to a card that you're sending out to someone. While you can tuck other things into pockets like embellishments or keepsakes, why not go ahead and make a little envelope out of vellum? Now, there are lots of ways to create envelopes on die-cut machines with templates. Here I have a punch by We Are Memory Keeper to create my envelopes. The only thing I would caution you with creating envelopes out of vellum is that vellum tends to crack more frequently than paper, so be gentle with your scoring and folding of the vellum. Other than that, you can just move forward with creating your project. I do like to use a specialty vellum adhesive for this so that you're not going to see any of that adhesive once your project is done, but you do have some flexibility there. Then you'll have the option to stash a wide variety of fun bits and pieces into these envelopes. Think of a lock of baby's hair, or sand from a beach vacation, or even dried flower petals from a wedding. There you saw me stash some confetti, and we'll get to actual shakers in a moment. But before we do that, let's talk about windows because the process is the same. I am going to create a window to reveal part of a photo, and I'm going to do that by kind of marking where I want my window to be, cutting a smaller circle out of my window frame, and then a larger circle out of vellum. And if you want to hide that glue that holds that vellum down, you could create a ring by punching a smaller circle, lining up your larger punch, and punching a bigger circle around that. That creates a ring that you can glue to your project. This is great card making technique, or like I'm using here for scrapbookers, you can create little windows that you can interact with and open up to reveal even more about your project. Okay, I mentioned shakers just a moment ago, and the process for creating a shaker is much the same as creating a window. A smaller circle out of your base for the shaker window, a larger circle out of a vellum to create the shaker block so you don't lose your bits and pieces. And then here I'm adding foam adhesive to the back of that window so that we can create a depth and dimension for the shaker bits to sit. Now, vellum does dull back the colors, so you might want to use a brighter color of shaker bits than you might otherwise use so that you don't lose the emphasis. But this is just one more nice option to add to your shaker creation techniques. Earlier, we talked about heat embossing on vellum, and now we're going to turn to what's called dry embossing. I'm going to use an embossing folder for this technique, and I just learned a tip not too long ago that makes this process much more successful, and that is to spray your vellum down with a mist of water before you run it through. So I'm just going to give it a light spray from a distance on top of this vellum, and it's good to know that vellum doesn't react well to water. It will curl up on you, but just flatten it out, stick it in your embossing folder, and run it through your die cut machine. Now, each machine will have a different sandwich, so you'll have to figure out what works for your machine. But once it comes out, you will have this beautiful embossed vellum. This is just a fantastic texture and layer to projects. I can't even tell you how much I love this one. We've gotten through the paper crafting techniques that I use. Let's go ahead and turn to some home decor. I'm going to create a decorative votive holder. Use electronic candles for this, please. Don't use live flame. You can start fires. I cut a strip 3 inches wide and I score it every 2 inches until I have 4 sides, and then a final score to create a little flap, and I cut off the excess and glue it down, and that will be the back of my votive holder. Now, before you get to all of the gluing together, make sure you do your decoration ahead of time because it's much easier to do when your vellum is flat as opposed to when it's in its 3D votive shape. Here you can see I decorated mine with some stamping and a little bit of that stained glass technique. Speaking of which, let's move on to that. It is called the stained glass technique for a reason. Much like an actual stained glass window, you can create a mini little window decoration piece that you can hang in your home, and when the light shines through it, you'll get a very pretty effect. I am creating my stained glass by cutting a nice big rectangle. I'm going to use a nice big stamped image on it, and I'm going to heat emboss it like we've already done, and then I will color it on the backside with my regular markers like we've already done, and that will result in this colorful piece. And you can see the difference between the backside and this front side of this project. So let's go ahead and turn this into a finished piece. I'm going to cut some strips of pattern paper. These are, I believe, a 1/2 inch wide. I'm just going to line them up all around the edge of my stained glass piece to create a frame. I do overlap those pieces, and then when I slice off the excess, the next bit is optional. You can cut from outer corner to inner corner to create a little bit of a mitered look to that frame. That gives it more of a traditional frame look. It's a little bit lost on this busy pattern paper, but I just wanted to show that to you in case you were interested in that. I am going to staple some ribbon to this, and that will create the hanging element. And if you want to, you can finish off the back side as well, since this will be visible through a window. I'm going to finish mine off with kind of a peaceful, motivational saying on there, which will be readable from the inside, but that's where I'm going to view this project most of the time anyway. And so that finishes off this stained glass decor piece, as well as this video. So let's take a quick review of everything we've done. We've talked about the dimming effect of vellum, how that can be used to create patterns. We've talked about using it as layers, both matte layers behind photos or layers behind embellishment clusters. We've talked about stamping on vellum and how that can help separate your stamping out from busy patterns. Stamping leads us into heat embossing in various forms. We can back our cut files with vellum for a softer, easier look than a traditional backing. We can play with alcohol ink techniques on vellum and not need that expensive Yupo paper. We can do our journaling on vellum both by hand and through the printer. We can create pockets to hide extra bits and pieces on our project, or we can do the same thing with little envelopes. We can create windows for an interactive element to a project, or we can create shakers with the same window technique. And then we have this lovely option of some dry embossing, as well as a few home decor pieces like decorative votive holders and an actual stained glass home decor piece. All right, we've covered so many things about vellums. Did I miss something that you really enjoy to do with vellum? Let us know so we can all learn together. I would appreciate a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video because that does help my channel. And tomorrow I will be back with a layout using many of these vellum techniques, so do join me then.